I'm Jay Hall, representing AURN, and we are talking TV1 decades. I got right here Colby Cobb Tyner. How you doing, good sir?
Good. Colby Colb. Colby Colb.
Colby Colb.
Not corner the Cobb. Colby Colb, bro.
Yo, real talk. It's something when you see somebody's name for all these years, and to actually pronounce it is always going to be like, can I knock this out? Because I've been having it in my head for a very long time. But
for sure.
How you doing, good sir?
I'm good, man. How you doing?
That's good. That's good. I know that you are senior VP. You've been working in Radio One for some time now, putting in that work. I got a chance to watch a preview of the decades. So, it's interesting to see your commentary over the years because, you come from the programming side. And so when I see, I know you got pictures of, Will Smith, and you've seen hip hop itself go through so many changes. In the 90s in particular, what was the shift that you would say you saw once the decade hit versus in the 80s?
For hip hop?
Yeah, for hip hop.
Well, I would say the 90s, and on my podcast, I talk about it all the time. It's the 90s was a renaissance period for hip hop, a very interesting time in music history. And so I'm the first generation child of hip hop. So literally watched it be created and all the things that happened with it. And literally to today, I can kind of go through in my brain all of my hip hop experiences. So late 70s, early 80s hip hop, and then mid 80s hip hop, and kind of how that first big explosion happened, commercial explosion happened with the, Run DMC and LL and all these big artists. And then you get to the 90s, and it was sort of like this renaissance where the West Coast started to blossom, and you had NWA and Eazy-E and Ice-T and all of this energy out there. And then New York kind of was like off for a little bit. And then New York kind of came in with, Nas, Wu-Tang, Biggie, then Jay-Z. And so Tribe Called Quest, like you have all of this energy happening. And then everybody was naturally going platinum. And then radio started to, because at the time, 90s was the decade where radio stopped relegating hip hop to late at night or nights and overnights. And all of a sudden you started hearing these artists all day. All of a sudden these artists were interviewed on the big morning shows in all of the markets. And so that was, really the Renaissance period. And if you look at it, the 90s really determined a big, footprint in culture that we see now, right? From Will Smith to, Jay-Z to, Nas and Wu-Tang just announced that they were going on a big summer tour. So like there's a lot of iconic energy. I mean, Fat Joe, who's still relevant today, came out in 93, Common. All of that energy is, sort of like cemented in a lot of our brains. And we can look back to that decade and see that, how impactful all of these folks were musically and culturally.
Yeah, I'm low key. I'm a fan of your backstory podcast. You just did one on Tribe Called Quest.
Yeah,
that was pretty good. I could tell that you are definitely a fan when it comes to that. And what you said something was real significant because I do remember growing up in Detroit as a child, hip hop waiting for that after 6 o'clock, especially when I had a half day of school. I didn't hear it. Like I remember them playing Bone Thugs and Harmony Crossroads, the instrumental, on our radio station, but after 6 was when we got a chance to have our time. But I don't remember the exact year, of course, but when it all of a sudden I can hear my rap all day.
Yeah, late 90s is when it happened. But what also happened in the early 90s was the rhythm format in radio. You worked at PGC, so that was one of the first big rhythm stations. But the rhythm format was the first format that really took hip hop and played it all day. But rhythm was really designed to, was really almost black music for non-black audiences, right? Like, and that was comfortable, and the presentation was geared toward them from a general market perspective, but it would be the same songs. I mean, I remember in Philly we had a no rap workday on the station. I mean, I was the youngest guy at the Power 99 when I got started, and we had a promos and drops and sweepers. It was a no rap workday, and then at night we play hip hop. Well, that was their way of getting that $25, $54. So you had that energy, and those people in charge were making the decisions throughout the 90s, and they had to get out of the way because the cultural growth of hip hop, the again Renaissance happening, it became too much. And then the rhythm stations were coming into markets, and guess what? They was knocking off the heritage urban mainstream stations that were sort of like quasi urban ACs during the day and hip hop stations at night. So the 90s was so pivotal to all of that. That was really what was happening. And I was a young person, and I was that young kid, you know, telling the older program directors, I call them well, in my podcast I mentioned them. I call them the hard shoe crew, like, you know, shoes and slacks, and, you know, very, you know, where hip hop we were jeans, sneakers, and shirts, and, you know, we were kind of, you know, you couldn't keep us down, like we were going to grow. And hard bottoms, I call them hard bottoms. So them hard bottom programmers either had to step up or get out the way. And a lot of them got out the way, had to be pushed out of the way and change. I mean, even in my own station, we got rid of the hard bottom programmer, and, you know, gave it to a woman who was just hip to what was going on and was able to kind of transform the radio station. But, you know, you had to change the people at the top because they just weren't understanding the culture that was happening around. You know, you see a song and it would just go nuts. And it's like, you can't wait till 6 o'clock to play that song. You got to play it all day, you know? Yeah. But then you had talent on the air who were the kind of talent that just didn't understand hip hop. That's that kid stuff, or, you know, play that stuff at night, or I don't get it, or whatever. And so there was a lot of transformation that happened in the Black media space in the 90s because the music was so powerful.
Yeah, you talk about it was so many things that you can make that can make the argument stronger. But for a generation that would have no idea, I was watching the preview of the decades, and it talked about something I had even learned about at Howard, was the importance of SoundScan. And I remember when SoundScan, well, we had learned about what it told the truth between people thinking that Guns N' Roses was number one, but it was really NWA Straight Outta Compton. Can you talk about that a little bit as a programmer, as far as having that definitive proof of, hey, listen, this is something that to be taken seriously?
Yeah, well, no, it was Niggas for Life from NWA was the number one album.
Yeah,
in '91, yeah. And that was like, what? You know, that was like Niggas for Life. What is that? What, you know, that freaked a lot of people out. You could kind of say that streaming also was sort of like a way that broke through. Streaming broke through the myth of, you know, hiding the power of hip hop in the recent years. In fact, recently, a lot of the streaming places that counted, they have changed the metrics of how they get the data. So now all of a sudden, you know, the top 10 songs are no longer hip hop, meaning the top 10 songs streaming in the country were all hip hop records until a couple of the people changed up. Well, we don't take Spotify data anymore or whatever. It's just the politics of it. But in SoundScan era, yeah, SoundScan was like, that's when you had the run of a big hip hop album would come out and would go number one every time it would come out and sell an astronomically amount of records first week. And that was really the power of the culture at the time. And now we kind of see it I'm just comparing decades and times, but now we see it with a release of an artist. We'll put a song out and people can stream it right away. People all have pretty much adapted to paying a monthly fee to have access to music now. And so they would start streaming it. And then you would see, you know, a hip hop artist. So I don't know why, Alexa, you're talking, because I was not talking to you. Then you would start to see songs would, now you see songs that, you know, from rando hip hop artists would have the number one song in the country, like out the box, because that song streams as much. Well, SoundScan was definitely of that era, but that was more of an album thing. So you would really see the power of the music in that moment. And that was NWA, Niggas for Life in '91 was like a big eye opener about how, because they were, you know, another thing about them too was because the difference between the East Coast and the West Coast in regards to hip hop consumption in the 90s, the East Coast we were, didn't have cars. Like some had cars, but we were all on public transportation. It was a different, mindset on how we consumed music. Where in the West Coast, everybody had a car. Like that was just the thing.
Yeah, we had cars.
Yeah, right. So
we had cars.
So you pull out the NWA CD or cassette at the time, and it's like boom, like everybody buys it and cops it differently than on the East Coast, and that helped explode when the West Coast got involved and the South got involved, and then Outkast and all these other people started, showing up as big time, artists in the format. You really see it through SoundScan. You would see, and you could go and look at the places and see the explosive growth of sales. And yeah, we were outpacing all the rock and the pop. I mean, we had a little boy band thing that happened in the 90s that kind of like gave pop music a lift, but nothing could stop the onslaught of hip hop. And if it was an artist that had any kind of following, that first week would be the people would move, pop artists and country artists would move their releases away from a potential hip hop artist that would be number one, because it would happen. They would be number one in the SoundScan era. And so you would wait a week. And, that helped kind of shape that decade, because radio had to be like, yo, what are we doing? We gotta play more of this music. And it was a sea change in culture, and you always want to be, you always want to be in front of that. You never want to be behind that. You want to be moving when it's changing.
It also seemed like it was during that period, it was when I was reliving, watching decades, a perfect storm too, because you had these events like the OJ trial, you had the LA riots, and you also had the Million Man March, and even the Million Woman March, which I didn't even know about until
in Philadelphia. Yeah,
in Philadelphia. Yeah. And you had all these things that also gave, that hip hop was talking about, that gave a boost to it, that were just undeniable. But in our culture, especially like in Black music, we never technically needed I would say like the sales for it to have impact. But it also seemed like the 90s was that time where they started to match, where we could make the argument. Out of those events I named, or even for yourself, what was a actual main event that you would say where the music had caught a boost?
Well, I will say that from a Black music perspective, the 90s was also the decade where we went from one Black station to two Black stations in most markets, because the hip hop was so powerful that it needed to have its own station of hip hop and R&B. And then you had Urban AC, which then took all of those 70s and 80s records that you really couldn't play on the one station that used to play everything in every market anymore. You couldn't get away with that. But from an event perspective, what was something that was just a sea change in the 90s? That's a really good question. I definitely think NWA in general was a high watermark for change in the culture, because there was a little bit of profanity in music, but they really just came from another perspective. And the 92 riots, which was in LA, which were, just horrific, you could kind of say hip hop had told you 4 years leading up to that. I can't remember the girls, the 15-year-old girl, LaShonda. I can't remember her name. She got killed by the Korean.
Yeah, man. Korean, Hawkins, I think, something like that.
Yeah. So it was like that. And then it was like almost
Latasha Harlan.
Latasha Harlan. So if you listen to, like, in LA, if you were listening to the music leading up to April 29th, literally next week next Friday is the anniversary of the 30th anniversary of the riots in LA. If you listened a few years before that, they were telling you what was going to happen. And so to me, that really showed how powerful the music was. And when the riots in April of 1992 happened, it had a mushroom effect throughout the country. They were trying to, we did this concert, they still do it now, called Powerhouse in Philly. And we had to cancel our Powerhouse concert because they were afraid for young Black people to get together. This is 1992. It was like May of like a few weeks after the riots. They were like, we can't. The mayor of Philadelphia, Ed Rendell, who was the governor of Pennsylvania for a while and a big figure in the Democratic Party, made us cancel or postpone our concert. We literally had to postpone it because they were afraid of a group of Black kids getting together at a concert in reaction. And it was pretty much a hip hop concert. I mean, there were a couple R&B groups on there, but there were some hip hop groups, but it wasn't nobody like NWA or anything. But they made us cancel the show because they didn't want us to get together because they were fearful of the music and the impact of the music. And we kind of don't want to suppress it in a way. And if you go back in history, I mean, it's the famous James Brown concert in Boston the night that Martin Luther King died, and they were so afraid of having that concert, and then the city of Boston agreed to air the concert on television live, and so everybody could kind of watch it and stay at home. And so that prevented, Boston was the only major US city that did not have rioting the night Martin Luther King died. So there is a certain fear factor in us getting together when we like music or come together. And that was a pivotal moment, I think, the LA riots, and it really showed the power of hip hop. And then after that, you could think about all of the artists that came after that moment. I mean, really, like, you know, that was 92, and then 93 was Nas and Wu-Tang. And then you had, you know, all of the different artists out in the West Coast. It was just like a sea swell of artists. The Bay Area had a bunch of artists that were like very impactful culture creators in that era, and, you know, helped. You really had two layers of West Coast artists happening, Northern California and Southern California. But that era was just, that moment, the riots really helped define the rest of that decade musically, because the music kind of told everybody what was going to happen. And trust me, the authorities, the people in control of it, I don't know if you remember, but it was during that era that the FBI went after Ice-T. They went after NWA after Police. They went after Ice-T over Cop Killer, because they just thought that the music was having this power. And then you have, in the background, you have a young Tupac Shakur who started his journey. His journey was really 91 to 90, 97, 96 when he died. That 5 years. Like, Tupac went from basically a gopher for the Digital Underground in the background to this major, massive artist in 96. That's only a 5-year period, but also it was a year of a decade of transition, because we were going from the Reaganomics and the first Bush presidency, which really suppressed the African Americans, really suppressed the economy for poor people, into the Clinton era of 92 and beyond, which was a great moment from an economic standpoint, but it was also the beginning of mass incarceration, which put a whole bunch of people in jail and ruined a whole bunch of families across the country. So you kind of have that as another major impact moment in the 90s that had a very big impact on the music.
You know, I'm around my mentees a lot, and, you know, hip hop is so accessible right now. The culture is so accessible, and it's so accepted amongst everyone now. But you brought up something that I was going to ask you. It's almost like we're on the same page. How much hip hop was also under attack? You know, there was the C. Dolores Tuckers, and there were people that was actually trying to laws. And it felt like to me as a child that it could be taken away from me any moment.
Well, I see Dolores Tucker was from Philadelphia. I don't know if she was from Philly, but she was in Philly. Like, she was, I remember this because I was doing a hip hop show. So again, I was doing a hip hop show at the time, and it was so much criticism of the music. And then you got into Tipper Gore, who was the wife of the vice president, who heard her daughter listening to a rap album, and she was the reason behind all of the
reason why we got the parental advisory right now.
Your parental advisory on the album. So yeah, no, it was, and then see the Dolores Tucker. I remember being at an event with her, and I just remember it was, and again, it was showed the fracture between the older and the younger generation, and which is historic. I mean, the same thing could be said about the James Brown era. You know, the older generation, like it's been going on since the beginning of time. but, you know, the young Black culture was, you know, criminalized, was not given a lot of opportunities. And out of that comes this culture of hip hop. And hip hop was born from economic struggle with nothing, no social programs. If you go back to the Reaganomics and what he did to the country, a lot of right-wing folks put him on a pedestal. But the Reagan years were just awful for young Black America. It was awful for families. And, you know, from that is what hip hop came about of. I mean, it was literally no social programs, you know, buildings crumbling around you, schools awful, crime, violence. And so if you wanted to stay out of trouble, you got into music, you know, and that's really was the initial part of hip hop culture. And again, the 90s were, oh my God, this thing got so big. And so a lot of powers that be were like, we got to figure out a way to stop it, to slow it down, to, you know, because they always remember from the beginning, it was a fad, it was going to go away. Yep. But the 90s was that decade, it just exploded. Like it just exploded and then paved the way for the 2000s, which were, you know, it was a superstar era, you know? I mean, you know, you think about all of the different artists that came out of the 90s, and then you had your seminal Biggie, Tupac moment, who were icons by 97, and then Jay-Z comes out in 96. And then, you know, you got your expansion. Really, this one, Atlanta probably took over in the early 2000s when you started to see all of that energy coming out of Atlanta. You had Nelly coming out of St. Louis. Every major city was starting to have a different type of artist, but that was all because of the 90s. The history of the 90s will be looked back upon as the starting point for the explosion of hip hop all across the world. It was really at that moment when you started to see all of the things that happened in the 90s. And it probably, the death of Tupac, that 6 month Tupac Biggie period was an awful time for the culture because you thought that was it. All the naysayers of all the people, see, we told you it's violent, you know, we got to do something about it. But man, all it did was just explode to another level after that. Even with those tragedies, it blew to another level. Like it didn't slow down. It just got bigger and better.
Talk about that for a quick second, since you were actually working, because a lot of times when they talk to the artists of that golden era, they talk about the East Coast, West Coast feud, and they talk about how a lot of the artists blame the media and stuff like that. So as someone who was working in media, could you say that the media held responsible to it, or was it fabricated, you know, since you were actually there to witness it up close?
It was a very interesting period. And I covered this extensively in my podcast because I really like to tell the story of what was happening in the moment. And, you know, the introduction of Suge Knight into the music business was the beginning of the criminal element. And I'm not calling him a criminal. I'm saying that he was not a corporate person or understanding of corporate, what that means in a business structure. He was and to be honest, you know, people don't realize this. Like Suge Knight was not from the hood. He was actually from a middle class family. He had a college. I don't know if he finished college, but he played college football. He went to UNLV, and then, but he brought this element into this gang street criminal element, and I started to see it in the conventions. Because I would go to the urban music conventions, the Jack the Rappers, the Impact, and the Gavin, in which was in San Francisco. And you would start to see the change in the type of people that would come to these events, or the type of people that would have labels. And a lot of them were drug dealers or criminal elements that got involved and engaged in the culture. So I would say that moment was really, or era was really impactful in regarding to changing how we just did stuff. And that criminal element, that, you know, it only got worse after Biggie and Tupac died, because then you would start to see a lot of artists that would get killed or, you know, get arrested. Everybody was getting arrested. I mean, everybody was arrested and going to jail. It was sort of like a common theme was for the artists that they all had to have some sort of jail record, and the music got a lot darker too. Like we had in the 90s, you had a balance of darkness and light, and then it just really moved. And today it's just super dark. I mean, there's not much light in the culture today.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't seem like, it also too, what takes from it is, I had to wait for my radio DJ or personality to tell me what was hot. You know what I mean? When you told
Oh
me
yeah.
what was hot, when you told me what was
Yeah.
hot, that's what I went with. And
Not
now
now.
it's the reverse.
Yeah, it's much different now.
it's,
Yeah.
it's much different. And do you think that helps or like hurts the culture within itself of the 90s? Do you think it was better in that sense because everybody couldn't play ball? Or is it better now that everybody can play ball?
I'm a little bit different when you ask me a question like that. I'm a futurist, so like I believe in change, and I don't think things staying the same is always a good thing. I they're good and bad with that question. The good is I feel that if you're an artist and you're a creative, you don't have to wait for somebody to sign you to expose you. You can make a beat and a song and put it on YouTube and wake up the next day, and millions of people know your song, right? And then a label's calling you and you're going to get a deal. I think things can move a lot faster now because of the different avenues. But also for an artist, you control your own destiny a little bit more now. You don't have to sign with anybody. You can do it independently and use social media. And guess what? You can be independently and sell equivalents of 100,000 albums, and you're not paying $7 an album to no label, and you're making all the money. $100,000, 100,000 albums, so whatever it is now with streaming. If you are getting that money directly to yourself and not having to pay a middleman, which we used to be the label, it's a great opportunity for you to make a living. And I think a lot of people make a living now between putting their own music out, doing their own tours, having their own merch, using their platforms to create other business opportunities for themselves. I mean, we've got, Rihanna's a billionaire, Jay-Z's a billionaire, Dr. Dre is a billionaire, Diddy's almost a billionaire. These are people that use their platform to transform themselves. And again, Dre, Diddy, and Jay-Z are from the 90s. Like that was that period where they got a chance to see the old model and they created a new model for themselves and for the industry.
Yeah, you're right. You don't have to shop your demo around or air check. You know what I mean? to that.
Nope, do a podcast. If you want to do a show, you can do a podcast.
Yeah,
you ain't got to wait for nobody.
Yeah, you don't have to wait for nobody. This last one I got to ask you, it's a personal question just for you. What's something that you would say to yourself and you would tell in your story that is unforgettable in the 90s? That's just legendary, like the moment or the music or the year. Which one would you say that's just unforgettable?
I would say I always go back to Jay-Z because I kind of feel like Jay-Z the first time I met Jay-Z or the first time I heard Jay-Z was when he was with Original Flavor, and I booked them on a show. I used to do these, in Philly, we would have the Greek picnic. And so that was like, people would, young Black college students would come in from all over the country for the Greek picnic. And I would do a big concert every year because I had the hip hop show. So I would get all the hip hop artists to come to town. And I liked Original Flavor, and I booked them because I liked Jay-Z's verse on it. And then a year later, he was solo, and I had a chance to interview him when him and Dame were doing their famous East Coast. Any artist did it. They would start in New York and just go down the East Coast in their cars and hit every radio station. And watching that period, and then a year later, the Reasonable Doubt comes out. At the same time, Reasonable Doubt comes out a few months before Tupac died, and then Biggie dies right after that. And just how he ascended after that happened. And I just think that was fascinating to watch, because he was literally, like just a fly on the wall. And then the series of things happened in hip hop. And when the dust cleared, Jay-Z comes out with his second album in 97, but in 98, he comes out with his third album, Volume 1, Hard Knock Life, whatever that was called.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest selling album of his career. That was one of the biggest selling rap albums ever at the time. It was 6 million sold. Outside of Biggie and Tupac, an artist from New York, nobody was selling records like that. And I think that's a great, really 95 to 98 watching him. And then look what's going on with him now. Like, that to me is fascinating. And I've done 3 episodes of the Backstory podcast on Jay-Z because I interviewed him throughout that whole time period. I interviewed him. So I was able to kind of show in real time the things that he was doing. And he was much different from any other artist that had been out at the time. What I always found interesting about him was there was sort of a hierarchy of the way things were, and he didn't give a crap about that. And he broke all the rules. And he, if you go to YouTube and Google the In My Lifetime video from Jay-Z, and you see it, he flew a whole bunch of people to Saint-Tropez on a yacht and on an island. He wasn't on a major label. Like, that was a very expensive video to make, right? He would talk in his boat. He would talk in his songs about the current rappers and be disrespectful to them and be throwing subliminals at him. And he wasn't on a major label. So again, he was so far ahead of everybody else. And it's something I'll never forget, that period. And, I'm always, every time I see him, I always tell him, like, man, no one would ever have predicted that. Right. And then to be an ambassador in the music business, and a global ambassador, but also just such a power player for all genres of music. Everybody goes through Hove. Like, he's just that guy. Mm-hmm. And, I just remember this kid I met, and I interviewed him in September of 1995, and a lot of people didn't know who he was. And, a year later, he puts out an album that's iconic. And now, 30 years later or 25 years later, he's a billionaire and a global, icon, right? And that, to me, he's a really good person to just say, if you want to look at the 90s, to see as somebody who kind of came from that era, but who kind of studied it, and he parlayed it into such an amazing, massive career, not just massive wealth, but just massive success. I mean, that to me is, something I'll never forget. And I'm glad I was a part of it, and I can kind of share the story in my own way through the content that I was able to get during that time period.
Yeah, him winning that MTV award, and Big and Pac's mom were the one that announced his name, will always remain in me. It felt unofficial, like a torch was passed, and he carried it. He carried it well. Before we go, when we get another backstory, Colb?
It just takes so long for me to do them. So I have Easy E that I needed to release, and Queen Latifah is another person that I want to release. It's just the time and the energy and the effort that goes into them. It requires a lot of time and research, and I'm just busy. I mean, I've just got a lot going on. So that whole podcast was really a hobby of mine. And so hopefully soon I'll be able to kind of get back in it, but sort of life got in the way. Yeah,
just want to let you know you got somebody who's looking forward to the next.
Appreciate that, man. I appreciate that.
It's just that was a personal question for me, so I'd like to say thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate you, Colby Colb. You can catch TV1's Decades on TV1. Make sure you check that out. I appreciate you joining. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Jay Hall representing AURN, and this has been good. Thank you very much, brother.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate you.
Mm-hmm.